Hello and welcome to another edition of the Iain Dale All Talk podcast. I'm Iain Dale. Joining me today is one of the country's top broadcasters, somebody whose face you will all know, and if you are listening to this on the podcast, you can also watch it on the LBC YouTube channel. It's Nick Robinson. Nick, hi.
Hello,
welcome.
Nice to be here.
I've wanted to get you on for a long time because I listen a lot to your own podcast, Political Thinking. And let's start by talking about podcasts, because I get the feeling that you regard your podcast as you being able to let loose a bit. Sort of, it's very different in format to the structures that you have to abide by on the Today programme, isn't it?
I think that's absolutely right. But Ian, I'm confused now. I thought I'd been brought to Global because you wanted to offer another BBC man a job. Well, I was literally waiting to see where I signed on.
We'll wait for that until we're off air, because obviously I have the power to do that.
But you're right, and in a sense, that answer is in a kind of illustration of what podcasts allowed you to do, that the very formal and time-limited, because that's important, interview on a news programme often doesn't. I took a conscious decision when I had a podcast, and frankly started it before I really knew what a podcast was. I mean, they are very popular now. There are thousands of them. But when I started, they were relatively new in this country at least, which was here was a chance not just for a longer interview, but for a more relaxed conversation, not an interrogation, not designed to get news stories, not designed to have a gotcha, but a conversation. And the idea I had, and you, I know, think this, you've written about it in your book, was that the politicians you and I know, as we've been around politics and news for decades, are not the two-dimensional soundbite merchants that they can often appear to be when sitting in this studio or in my studio at the Today programme on BBC Radio 4. And that finding a vehicle that allowed them to reveal who they were, allowed them to tell their stories, their background stories, would do something which I'm delighted to say it has done, which is people, if they talk to me about my podcast at all, they say, I listened to Political Thinking the other day, and that person I really hate, they're quite decent, aren't they? I still don't agree with them. Yeah. And then they'll pick up what they don't agree with. And they'll also say, God, I really get where they're coming from now. Because there's often something, as you will know, in someone's background, in their roots, in their parents, in their early life experiences, that makes you think, that's why they're a Tory, or that's why they're Labour.
But there are some people who say that, well, you're not doing your job with this type of podcast because you're having a nice, cosy little chat with a politician. You're not sort of analysing all their mistakes. And it's all I would say, yeah, you can get to know the politician better, and it feeds into the political conversation. But are we doing what we're supposed to be there to do?
Well, I think there's more than one job to be done in interviews, and my goodness me, there's no shortage of interviews, is there? So I think so long as it's a complement to, rather than an alternative to, them being held to account, then this sort of conversation that you have with the likes of me, but you have with politicians, is fine. There is a but, though, there, providing it's an addition to accountability. Yeah. And I do think there's a real difficulty emerging in this country, and it's not just here, it's right around the world, actually, that many elected politicians have decided it is safer to never come in this studio. It's safer never to come in my studio. They think it's much easier to do a clip for the TV news, to appear on their own social media accounts, because then they're in control and they get rid of someone who's getting in the way.
Up to a point. I think it's not necessarily them. I think it's all their media people that decide this for them, and they don't push back on it enough. I know plenty of politicians who'd be quite happy to come in every day of the week, but they're not allowed to because the Downing Street spin doctors, or maybe the opposition spin doctors, say, no, we want to do it this way.
No, I think there's a lot in what you say. And throughout recent times, people who are in politics have complained at the spin doctors. But for goodness sake, these are people who either do run the country or want to run the country. If they can't stand up to someone, whether they're 23 or 33, and say, I believe in the power of explanation. You see, it seems to me that this has come from the top in politics. Not just from Boris Johnson, let me stress, but Boris certainly hates interviews. He doesn't think he's good at interviews. What he knows he's brilliant at is the politics of narrative, if you like. He finds the sort of pernickety, but hold on, didn't you say 3 months ago? And hold on, that stat you've given isn't quite right, is it? And excuse me, what about he hates that. And there's some power in what he believes that for most ordinary people, the power of narrative, the storytelling, this is the direction we're going in, this is who we're against, is what their life is really like. And I think we have to acknowledge that. But Boris certainly doesn't like interviews and tries to do not very many of them. But that was true, to be fair to him, of Theresa May, who also found them incredibly uncomfortable. Jeremy Corbyn loathed doing interviews. Gordon Brown did quite a lot, but really didn't like them. Indeed, it's only the real stars of political communication, Thatcher, Blair, to some extent David Cameron too, who relished coming in these places because they thought argument was what persuaded, that listening to the kind of power of an argument was what would persuade people. And I wish we could do more of it.
But the other thing is that I always say this to when invariably you cannot get a minister to come on a programme to explain a policy. I mean, it just seems to happen more and more. And I keep saying to them, well, if you don't explain the policies, who do you think is going to do it for you? And I mean, I find it incomprehensible that they don't seem to understand that, and that's why they should put MPs on any programme that actually asks for them.
Well, you know, Ian, I think they do think somebody will explain it for them. I mean,
who?
Let's take the example of the Rwanda policy. Hugely controversial, very popular with some, deeply unpopular and regarded as immoral by others, as you'll know from your discussions on your programme. Priti Patel has not been on the Today programme to discuss it since it was floated. Priti Patel doesn't do many, it's not none, but it's quite close to none, broadcast interviews. Who does she think is making the case for? Well, it's partly the people that CCHQ, Conservative Central Headquarters, believe are good communicators. People have no responsibility for the policy at all, by the way, so can't really be held to account. They're not in the right department, they're not in the meetings, they haven't looked at the pros and the cons, but they can make an argument. But I tell you who else they think can do it. Newspaper editorials, newspaper front pages, and increasingly, talk jocks. We are getting in this country, of which there are one or two honourable examples on your own network on LBC, talk jocks, people who talk for a living, people who make an argument for a living, people who are partly journalists, but in truth are advocates most of the time, or full-time controversialists, whether it's this network, whether it's GB News, whether it's the new Talk TV. These
I
are
hope
people.
You're not lumping us in with them, Nick.
Well, you're different because you do news gathering at LBC.
We do.
But there is a part of LBC which is about having a row.
Is there really? I mean, I look through our presenter schedule and I think to myself, which of our presenters fit that narrative? And there aren't very many.
Well, it used to be Nigel Farage, of course.
Well, I would push back on that, in that Nigel Farage, when he did his show, I thought was a brilliant broadcast.
Oh, and he is.
Now, he had a narrative, clearly, but I don't think he walked into that studio thinking, I'm going to have a row today. I think he walked into that studio wanting people to ring in to disagree with him, but he genuinely wanted to try and persuade them to his point of view. And that isn't necessarily the same as having a row.
No, that's a fair point, and Nigel Farage is indeed a brilliant broadcaster. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And he does listen to people he disagrees with. And he relishes picking...
He charms them,
and picking their arguments apart. James O'Brien, you know, is a brilliant broadcaster. But James and I have disagreed about this.
He will love the fact that you've bracketed
I know,
Nigel
exactly. That's
Farage.
why I deliberately did it. James and I have both publicly and privately had this conversation and disagreed with. I'm a vast admirer of him. I think he's a brilliant, brilliant broadcaster. I worry, though, that we are using unelected, well-paid broadcasters who have no accountability as substitutes for politicians. I don't mind them instead in addition to politicians, but I think there are politicians who think, why should we have this row? We can rely on name your broadcaster of choice to do it for us.
I can't think who you would be referring to there, because, I mean, look, I get a lot of attacks on social media if I say something where I agree with something the government's done, I'm a Tory shill. I mean, you've had that yourself,
of course.
haven't you?
Yeah.
But people never notice all the times I disagree, and there have been quite a lot of those in recent months. So I don't think there's anyone in Conservative campaign headquarters thinking, "Oh, don't worry, Iain Dale will explain that for us." And I can't think of any other body.
Let's take the Rwanda policy. I do think there are people
Certainly
who
didn't explain that one.
I do certainly think if you were in Tory HQ, you think, because you do the market research, that the market research, the concept is a popular concept. It's when you get to the detail of, will it work? How can it work? Is it right and fair, that then those numbers start to come down? So better not to do an interview in which that is what's discussed. Better to do an interview in which, say, Farage, for example, has a row with somebody about, do you really want these people coming over the water? Do you really want to give the benefit of the doubt to people traffickers? Because they want the row at the level of a Daily Mail front page or of a radio phone-in. And politics is the worst for that, because good policy, good governance, depends on detail as well as narrative. It depends on saying, whoa, hold on, we know that you want fewer people coming over the sea, but does this work anywhere else? What do the experts say? Now, you still may, at the end of all those questions, say, I'm still in favour of it. Take that policy. You might argue, there's a powerful argument, we desperately need a deterrent effect. We've got to do something to say, don't risk this journey beyond what you might have thought might be the big enough risk, which is the risk of death. That's fine. That's an argument. But you ought to go through the process. And the point I'm making to you is we see this explosion of talk in this country, we're actually seeing a reduction in accountability.
What do you put that down to? Because obviously there are lots of new entrants into this game at the moment, both on radio and television. Most people think, well, that shows the sign of a healthy political media, where there's more competition. Or do you think that competition is effectively going to diminish the quality?
Well, both things oddly could be true. My first point to you would be to say, where was the national conversation, the debate about whether this is a good idea or not?
Why should there be one?
Well, because ever since the creation of broadcasting, and it's 100 years since the creation of the BBC this year, there was this very odd concept. But it was not just a concept, it was a law. And indeed, it was something that the British in general felt rather proud about and boasted around the world. What was it? It was that broadcasting would be treated differently from other forms of communication. Broadcasting would be different from print. There would be an obligation to be impartial. Now, you can have an argument about whether you think people really are impartial and whether the BBC does it well enough, but the same law applied to LBC, but before LBC became the force that it now is to Sky and ITV and Channel 4 and Channel 5. Now, I think there's quite a big value in that. It's controversial, but there's a big value. Now, one view says, look, this is hopelessly out of date. At a time you can get whatever you want and watch it on your phone. At a time there's no technical difference between TV and streaming and radio. They're all sort of merged, aren't they? How does it make sense to have a different law for what we call broadcasting, what you and I are now doing? The other view is, look over the pond at the United States. This is a country that actively took a decision to get rid of what it called the Fair Speech Amendment. Or was it the Balanced Speech Amendment? Forgive me, I can't remember the word. I've been up since 3:30 and it's now already 7 hours in.
No excuses.
Presented by Bro. But it was a very important change that was made by their communications regulator, and says in future you will not have to be balanced. As a result, we got the creation of Fox News. Then you got the liberal alternatives, which are MSNBC, to some extent CNN. I think America is the poorer for it. People are right-wing, tend to watch Fox News for their news. People are liberal or left, tend to watch CNN and SBC. There's no shared facts. You can have a national debate about healthcare. Any fool could tell you Americans' healthcare system is broken. Anybody, of whatever their politics. They spend a vast proportion of their national wealth on it. But when Obama tried to have a debate, if you watched Fox News, you were told there were socialist death camps being planned in order to control demand. If you watched the the liberal media, you were told that the Republicans had a secret plot to allow the poor to die in the streets without health care. They were incapable of having a proper national conversation. And I think one thing that and I emphasise the word broadcasting does is empower people to have that debate. And my worry, and we're not there yet, we're way off yet, but my worry is, as networks rather less successful than LBC is with their listeners and viewers, they will fight by creating noise. Noise means argument. Noise does not mean facts, doesn't mean reporting, it doesn't mean journalism, it doesn't mean investing in people out on the ground telling you what's happening in a hospital or in Kyiv. It means overpaid people like you and me shouting at each other in order to get attention.
I think you're overpaid. I'm not. But we're doing this interview in our Millbank studio, which is essentially a television studio, but obviously we do radio in it. The interview that we're doing now is not regulated by Ofcom because, well, actually a bit of it may go out on the live programme. It is ridiculous that Ofcom controls what we do live on air, but doesn't regulate what we do in podcasts. I mean, so the law has to be updated, I think.
That's fine, Ian, and we've got a place where we update laws. It's called Parliament.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what we do is we have debates, and governments make proposals. That hasn't happened in this country. What's happened is we have changed the broadcasting landscape like that without so much as a paper being produced on whether it's a good idea.
But you can't blame the
and there's a
broadcasters
reason
for
that, by the way. No, I'm not. I'm not blaming broadcasters for a second. I'm blaming politicians and regulators for it. Broadcasters should get on and do their thing. They should make money. They should make programmes they think are good. No criticism of the broadcasters at all. Hats off to Rupert Murdoch, a man who has constantly innovated and generated competition and choice. I mean, genuinely hats off. It's not a very popular view among some of the people I work with, but he's done it. He did it with Sky. He's doing it now with Talk TV. He did it with his newspapers as well. Hats off to them and the creators of GB News and the people who turned this network from a pretty small network, LBC, into a big national force. Hats off to all of them, right? I'm in favour of choice and competition. What I'm arguing is that there has not been a conversation with those people who set the laws or set the regulations because they're a bit nervous to have it because they think people might not like it. And the reason this matters, Ian, is way back, you can see it's a bit of a passion of mine, way back in 2009, James Murdoch, then running Sky, gave a big speech, the biggest speech in the broadcast calendar year is something called the McTaggart, in which he argued, and you understood it, someone American educated, that regulating what could be said on broadcast was a form, and I paraphrase, it's not his actual phrase, but it was a form of socialism. And you wouldn't regulate all sorts of other things in life, other freedoms, so why the hell should you do it? Fine, that's his argument. I happen to know that the government at the time thought of changing the Ofcom regulations in order to get something quite similar to Talk TV. There was talk of an extra Sky channel. This is all fine if there's a national debate about it, if we consider what the losses are as well as the gains, and I don't think we are doing that.
Do you think part of the problem for this sector, though, is that there is only so much audience?
Yeah.
And you look at some of the figures for some of the programmes on these new channels, and you think, well, that cannot possibly survive. Now, Murdoch's got very deep pockets with Talk TV, and you can't judge a new channel on the first few weeks, but it is generally being outperformed by GB News, which I think it must be its main rival. So in the end, it is going to be a dirty knuckle fight, isn't it, between those two for survival? It's a bit like Sky and BSB back in the day.
Funny enough, as you started that question, I was thinking back to, for older listeners, they all remember the battle between what was called the square reel. Yeah. And then the one that won, of course, which is the Dish and Sky.
And VHS and Betamax.
Yeah.
Similar thing
exactly.
in a way.
And either that will happen, or as in newspapers, people will own television and radio networks, not to make money at all, but because they have views.
But how does the BBC respond to this? Because over the past 7 or 8 years, as I've watched the BBC react to the growth of LBC, I mean, I obviously know a lot of people at the BBC, and sometimes there have literally been committees formed and say, well, how come LBC did this so well and we didn't? I mean, I think of the Lee Rigby murder, for example, sort of breaking news story, which, I mean, I was on air when that was all happening. And there was apparently, I think Five Live might have been on a sporting event or something, and there was some big committee formed to look at how they should react. And you look at the visualisation that's happened of radio, which some of us, we understand it, but slightly, I mean, if I wanted to be a TV person, that's where I would have gone. But I'm predominantly a radio person, but I completely recognise we have to visualise it. But I think the BBC has failed in that immensely, in that challenge.
Well, the truth is the BBC's, in its entire history, and I wrote a book looking at the history of broadcasting and politics, which has rarely, I don't want to say never, has rarely been the innovator. There are two fantastically honourable exceptions, which are market dominant, which is the iPlayer, innovation from the BBC, one that would be much bigger if stupid governments and stupid regulators hadn't held it back, because the original idea was it would cooperate with ITV and Channel 4, be a big British success, compete with the likes of Netflix, but it was government and regulators that stopped them doing that when they wanted to do it. The other big, great success was, of course, the BBC website. It annoys people who are competing with it, and because it's free, but it is one of, I would argue, one of the global triumphs in terms of communication, because it's so well used. But you go way back in history. When ITV was created, they invented the modern television news bulletin. The BBC still had two warring factions where there was a group of people who, and I do mean this literally, had come from the radio newsroom. I'm going to sit up now for radio listeners, and they had sort of black tie on.
I mean, how dare you come into the studio without a tie on?
Without a tie.
Showing hairy chest.
Yeah, with a bit.
And you're not wearing your trademark glasses. I think you told me earlier this is the first interview you've done without wearing glasses.
God, I'm going to go to TV viewers or YouTube viewers. They're back. I had my eyes done recently, ladies and gentlemen. That's why. The BBC was hilarious about this. Because what happened is there was a bit of the news was this sort of John Snagg style. He was the wartime newsreader. And then these kind of louche types with sharp suits would appear who'd done what was called the film, the newsreel, And they'd do kind of cheeky, chappy reports about what was in the housewife's shopping basket. And it took ITN to come along, and they learned from America, to make the modern bulletin. And the BBC looked at that and thought, oh, God, and changed. And Sky will argue that they were the innovators in 24-hour news, for example. So often the BBC's responded to competition, which is why competition's healthy, of course. The thing I always try to say to people who emphasise the need for competition and for choice and for innovation is yes, 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 yes. Yes to all of the above. But do not kill the goose that laid the golden egg. The golden egg in this country is broadcast news you can trust. Every poll shows it. And there are people listening to this podcast where you say, oh, yeah, but the BBC's trust rating has gone down. They have gone down a bit. All broadcasts have gone down a bit in a more contentious age with more that divides us. American TV news and radio news would kill for the trust ratings that the BBC have got. They are incomparable. And that matters not whether you like the BBC or not. I would argue that the standards here at LBC are partly, and I only say partly, held up because of a need to compete with the BBC, because you see, a sort of gold standard broadcaster. Sometimes you're better, sometimes you're worse, but you want to compete with it. And I think there is a grave danger in this country that in the rush for the new, in the rush on both sides of politics, actually, to say, oh, God, we're sick of the BBC, all right, that we kill the golden goose.
I want to talk about Ukraine. Just tell me what your or how it came about that you went to Ukraine right at the beginning of the conflict, because I don't know the answer to this, and I think it's going to be a fascinating story.
I'm hesitating because I'm not sure it's a story I ought to really tell in a broadcast environment, because it pulls back the curtain on a lively conversation. I'm going to do this in a degree of code, if you're okay. Look. The big answer and the serious answer is, in the way that you and I do, I had a conversation with someone we have to in the code call a very senior member of the government about a week before, and I said, it was amazing, this intelligence you keep putting out there saying, there's going to be an invasion of Ukraine. You're sort of overdoing it a bit, aren't you? And this person sort of verbally grabbed me by the lapel, said, this is happening. This is absolute. Don't believe any of that. It's happening. Yeah, of course we don't know the exact date, but we do know for a fact it will happen.
One time the intelligence actually was right.
Yes, quite, which is one of the reasons that there were people around the world, I'm told, I've talked to diplomats, who sat in meetings with our Foreign Secretary in foreign capitals in Europe where she presented this evidence, which is partly American, of course, but heavily British as well, and they went, no, don't believe it, because of Iraq.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'd for more than a week saying, this is potentially the biggest thing in our lives. And I have a historical interest. You know, my parents were German Jewish refugees from Berlin. I was rather passionate when I was at university about issues about the Soviet Union representing a threat. So I cared. Now, on the day itself, the reason I smiled when you asked me the question, I was actually at Heathrow Airport going to go with my boys, one already there and one with me, to Madrid to watch Manchester United and have a couple of days off and quite a lot of beer. Now, most listeners will say, you don't want to watch United at the moment because you have to drink an awful lot of beer.
I wasn't going to say a word. I was not going to say a word.
You have to have a lot of beer. But I think it's fair to say that I thought our coverage the night before had not been as sharp as it perhaps should have been.
Listeners, this is the code bit.
Yeah, and I had expressed my view internally that I didn't think we'd quite spotted the moment or the importance of it. And quite reasonably, my bosses said, OK, leave Heathrow, go to Gatwick, get on a plane to Kyiv, don't get on a plane to Madrid. And
the reaction of your boys?
They ought to be here. I think stunned was the main one. I mean, it sort of minorly helped that I did, in the way of an embarrassed father, march my son to the nearest cash point and say, but here's some euros, have some beers and tapas.
I mean, we should
me.
make clear they're not like 13 or anything.
Or 7. No, they're 24. 24 and 21. So perfectly capable of getting on a plane on the road and having a good time. So,
and what was your, when you had that conversation, you'd agreed to go, was there a degree of excitement, trepidation? What were you feeling?
Yeah, sort of all of the above. Excitement mainly, in truth. Because if you're in our business, there are moments, aren't there?
Yeah.
You know, 100 yards from here in Westminster, occasionally the hairs on the back of your neck go up. You think, wow, I'll tell my friends, my children, I'll tell them this story. This was the day I was here when the Prime Minister fell. Or for me, it's largely been those sorts of political events. But I did cover the build-up to the Afghan wars, as the Iraq war, as political editor of ITV and then political editor of the BBC. But I felt that this war was arguably more important than either of those two. It was the end of the dream. I mean, I was very lucky in that as a young TV producer, I got sent to the Berlin Wall on the day it came down. And amazingly, we couldn't get a camera crew until the following day. There was such demand. In one way, it was nice for me because I stood on top of the Berlin Wall and looked down at those East German guards, looking up at these crowds of young people, thinking, this genuinely I'll remember all my life. This is a moment of history. And the reason this war is a similar moment of history is the dream that there was then of Europe whole and free, as they used to say, in Berlin, died. It's over. That's the dream of our generation, I think, in many ways. And therefore, of course, I was excited to be there.
And what happened when you got there? I mean, how do you even set up? I mean, how do you do your first broadcast?
We just thought we had to get some material straight away. We weren't going to broadcast the whole of the Today programme, 3-hour show. The following morning, it wasn't practical because we only arrived in the evening. So we just thought, let's get one thing that gives us a feel. So one of my producers in London had contacts in the comedy world and said, I'll find you a comedy club. So we went to a comedy club and talked to young comics about what they were expecting. Because the idea was to get people who are not political, just ordinary folk, talking about it. And it's one of those moments which I guess you sometimes have live on air. Luckily, this wasn't live, where my young comic thought that the really funny gag was to say that President Putin was spoiling her plans for a weekend of hot sex because she got a guy coming over from London. And no matter how many times I tried to kind of guide her to the fact that the early morning listeners of BBC Radio 4 probably didn't want to hear about hot sex, I couldn't get her to say anything different. But in a funny way, it did tell you something.
And did she just then say, and while you're here?
Yeah, yeah, she didn't seem interested in me at all. I think I'd already pointed out she was the age of my daughter. But in a way, it did tell you something, because life was just going on. Here was in many ways a recognisably Western capital in which life was going on. The following morning, we had a day before the bombing started. Obviously, we didn't know when it would start, but the following morning, we went to watch an ex-policeman sign up to volunteer. We went to a gun shop, and just walking down steps into a gun shop and seeing ordinary people, a housewife, accompanied by her husband, who had a great big roll of cash, paying for a new handgun for her. A nervous-looking middle-aged man who was buying ammunition. I said, "Who's that for?" He said, "For the Russians." I said, "You can't take on the Red Army." And he said, No, but if they come for my wife and my child, I come for them. And to make a connection with what I was saying before him, that's news gathering. I mean, my broadcasting is better because I've been.
Yeah.
Because I've got an understanding. That's news gathering, that's journalism, that's money. It's investment. Not in salaries, it's investment in sending people to places.
What are the challenges for a radio presenter in those circumstances? Because it's a sort of very visual thing, isn't it? Conflict coverage.
Yes.
And I always think it is much more difficult to really get the tone right, the mood right, just the choice of who you talk to. I mean, whereas... you've got Clive Murray on your screen. You can see the sort of lights in the background. It's much more difficult on radio, isn't it?
It is, but I think I was lucky in the build-up to conflict, or in the immediate aftermath of conflict. It's about the things you just said. It is about emotion and reaction, and those are verbal. So providing you can paint a picture with words, providing you remember to get some sound effects, after years of being a television correspondent, predominantly, I had to remind myself, if you can't hear it, it's not there. And therefore getting the click of the door, getting the footsteps, getting when you're in a gun shop, the kind of noise of, as they do, it becomes critical. Because actually it doesn't take very much to paint a sound picture, to transport someone there. But I felt that actually... Sometimes I see presenters go into the field and say, what's the point of you? I mean, they've got great war reporters. I mean, why do you need you to go? It's just a waste of time and money, isn't it? So you can stand there and say, I'm there. I felt on this occasion, I hope I'm right, that in a way there was a value in having someone who's not a war reporter, who just says, this is how it seems to me, and asking innocent questions. I'd love to go back, but I'd only go back if I felt I was adding value. There's absolutely no point in me going back and taking time up from Elise Doucette or a Jeremy Bowen or many of the other brilliant reporters in the field.
Which is interesting that certainly on the television side, I mean, Clive Murray, I think, has been back 3 times now, and then comes back for a couple of weeks and then goes back again. Yeah. What's the logic of that?
Well, I think just R&R.
Yeah.
That, I haven't talked to Clive about it, but I imagine it's a pretty full-on life.
Yeah.
Now, when I left...
And they're not staying in a Hilton hotel either,
no.
Are they?
Well, they are. They are staying. I'm not allowed to name the hotel, we're told, but they're staying in a perfectly nice hotel. But of course, it's rather less smart than it used to be. When I left, and things may have improved a bit. I left after a few days of the conflict. We were effectively living in a basement.
Yeah, that's kind of what I meant.
Underground car park 2. Now, to start with, we were able to be in our rooms, and then there was a WhatsApp group. And this is where the BBC's lucky. It's got a decent team of people now. We've got ex-soldiers. Certainly people in the armed forces who are our advisors there on that WhatsApp group. They'll either say, get to the basement now, or you might like to think about, or, put on your flak jacket, which is great to have someone taking or helping you take those decisions. But sitting in that basement, as I did just before going, sleeping there, scrabbling around, I found some sort of old rubber tubing, I think probably used by a plumber, which I used to kind of have a softer bed to...
So I was wondering where that was going.
Yeah, yes. Settle down. I raided the minibar. I'm not sure I've yet paid. Look, sorry. Do send me the bill. Raided the minibar of all the little
all of that shows. That is where the BBC comes into its own, because you have got the resources to do that. You've all had the conflict zone training. Yeah. And, I at the beginning of all of this, there was a sort of mad moment in my mind when I thought, I'd like to go and do what you were doing. And then I thought, don't be so bloody stupid. I mean, our reporters have had all of that kind of training.
Yeah.
Presenters don't generally do it. And I said this to my partner that I wanted to go, he said, are you mad? And basically forbade it.
Yeah.
But when you told your wife that you were heading off there, I mean, she must have been appalled.
Yeah. Well, I think it's fair to say her initial reaction was that she was appalled that I was abandoning our boys and not going to the football. So,
and then
I mean,
realised it must be important if you weren't going to go to the football.
That important, yeah. The truth is, we didn't have very long to talk about it because it was a instant decision. And, yeah, of course, she was worried, sick about it. Well, incredibly supportive about it as well. But the truth is, I didn't have much time to think about it. I went on an instinct, but I went because, just to emphasise, in case it sounds reckless, I do have to get retrained in how to deal with a hostile environment every 3 years, I think it is, 5 years intensely. Now, when we say train, that's like 5 days away from home, in a place where ex-soldiers don't quite beat you up because they're not allowed to, but you are put into situations where you feel like you're being kidnapped and black bags are put over your head. You have guns held to your head. I've had my nose put down in the mud. I mean, they try as much as they can without being directly physical with you, because that's what's happened and that wasn't good, to get you used to it. I mean, just for your amusement, Ian, if you ever did this, of course, they once insisted for kind of insurance reasons that Bob Geldof had to take part in this course before he did something for either comic relief or one of the many other causes that he supports. And he worked out, because everybody knows that there's a sort of kidnap scenario in this, that instead of going willingly and having this black bag put on his head at the side of the road, he'd scarper. So Bob scarpers, runs, and this bloke with a gun, obviously not loaded, runs after him, and Bob just keeps running and running until the police then get a call, because this is a disused airbase, because he's hit public land on the road. The police get a call saying, there's a bloke who looks awfully like Bob Geldof running down the road. This is a podcast, I assume I'm allowed to swear.
You are.
And looking over his shoulder going, fuck off!
So how long were you actually there?
Actually, you know how many nights was it? Was it 4 or 5? Very short time.
And how was the decision made that you were going to go?
To go in the first place or come back?
No, to come back.
Well, essentially, we took it. I mean, my editor, people above me said, are you okay, regularly? So there was a conversation.
That's nice of them.
But the conversation really was, I mean, because it got hairy rather quickly.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
The conversation really then was, how do you get out? And if you don't get out, will you be stuck for weeks?
Yeah.
Because at the time, and, you know, we keep having to remind ourselves this, don't we? When the time that the experts, not the kind of idiots, the experts said the Russians have bombed Hostomel, the military airbase just outside Kyiv, which they did on the first day. They're clearly going to land their squaddies. Then the big military carrier planes are going to land, and the armoured vehicles will arrive, and they'll roll through the streets. That was it. The feeling was, God, if you don't get out quite soon, you could be here for 6 weeks. There wasn't a fear that the Russians were targeting journalists. There'd be no evidence of that. Then there comes a thing which is, am I ready for all that? I had a rather trivial thing, which is I just didn't, you know, I'm still on medication, having been ill a few years ago. I literally didn't have the supplies with me. That was a concern. But there was another thing, really, which is, am I actually continuing to add value now? I felt in the first few days, I felt, and I got, you know, lovely feedback, and still now people stop me in the street, which is lovely, saying, you know, wow, that was a moment. Because it was one of those shared moments, wasn't it, where we all tuned in. It wasn't necessarily to my brain, but people tuned in. And I just thought, I've got now 2 days without a show, because I've done my Saturday show, we're not on again until Monday. Am I really, honestly, for Monday? Because there was also, by then, curfews lasting most of the day because of the fear that there were saboteurs on the street. We did one last trip, which I'm so pleased we did. We got a driver to take us out with a translator. The streets of Kyiv were completely deserted. We'd seen pictures of what looked to be and were claimed to be Russian tanks nearby, but nothing we saw. And as we're zooming past to get back, because we're on a sort of time limit, my producer shouts, "Stop!" And lots of people wanted to go ahead, and he said, I said, no, if you've seen something, go back. We roll the car back, and there through a gateway, looking a bit like an entrance to a sort of village school or something like that, are hundreds and hundreds of men. Volunteers in ordinary, the sort of clothes you'd wear if you're going for a walk in the country, their biggest boots they could find, pair of jeans, warm things, signing up. And we got out the car, and this is where radio can beat television. And the guy said, no cameras. So there was a camera with us, it went down. But even the sound, which I still vividly remember, there's a sound that goes, which was one of these volunteers getting a yellow sticky tape and wrapping it round the arm, and that said, you're one of us. Just the yellow sticky tape. And it's an amazing moment to witness.
In those situations, is there part of you that becomes a bit of a risk taker? Are you a bit of a daredevil?
Am I instinctively?
Yeah.
Well, I run to stories. The adrenaline, which is, by the way, one of the reasons you do a course, which is to teach yourself that you can be an idiot, you know. And one of the reasons one has security advisors is they know journalists are idiots. I mean that in inverted commas. If you listen sometimes to the top war reporters' reports on radio and television, you'll occasionally hear a voice saying, get down. That's the security advisor. Because for telly in particular, you can't look. The camera operator is looking at the reporter and can't see the peripheral vision because they're looking through the viewfinder. The reporter's looking into the camera and therefore is not aware of what's going. So the security guy or girl is the person who's looking everywhere, heads moving around, looking, and they're the person you just listen to, you know, says down. Or in this case, you know, when I went towards the gate, I looked at my security guys and he went, shook his head, went, don't even think about it. Don't even try it. You're getting interviews here, people are talking to you, they're wary, they're edgy, you know. And these guys are extraordinary. They're looking for is somebody pulling back on a trigger. Is somebody reaching into their pocket for a bit of...
What's the power dynamic there? Because, I mean, would you, I don't know, you probably didn't, but would you ever pull rank over a security person?
No.
Because they'd kill you.
Look, the people who are in the field all the time, the big names of war journalism, of course, you know, they have as much knowledge, sometimes more knowledge than their security advisor. They've been in lots of conflicts and lots of dangerous situations. So there might be an argument about it, there might be a dialogue.
I'm just imagining John Simpson talking to his security advisor.
I don't think John goes, oh, whatever you think, Jack.
Exactly.
Dear boy.
That's kind of what I meant.
Yeah, but if you're me, I'm a man in a suit who spent years standing outside empty buildings.
So how did you get out?
Well, we weren't sure we would, is the first answer. Because sort of nobody had. Now there are tried and tested routes. But we were the first group to leave. Now, at one level, it was a complete luxury, which, you know, only Western broadcasters could do. We had a nice van, you could charge your phone, there's a driver, there's a translator, there's a security advisor. In one sense, it's very comfortable. On the other hand, as the gates, there were one of those sort of gates in an underground garage, went up, we heard the air raid sirens go off. And so you're driving thinking, well, hold on, I can hear air raid sirens. And then totally empty, beautiful day in Kyiv. And then I remember going round a corner and suddenly there's a volunteer, and you could tell because they haven't got proper uniforms, with an enormous gun. There's a sort of makeshift roadblock. And he sort of waves his hands to say that bridge has been bombed. Now, in this case, I think it had actually been bombed by the Ukrainians to stop the Russians using it. So it does get a bit sweaty. We went into, I guess, what would be the kind of North Circular Road equivalent of Kyiv, and there were sort of woods around it. And there was a sort of much more twitchy-looking guy with a gun, and this mound of soil and twigs and branches that had been built into a roadblock, who said, we've got visitors, which we took to mean there were Russians in the wood, and he looked at the wood. That was quite nerve-wracking. There was, by then, the sound of munitions falling, albeit quite a long way away.
And were you recording stuff all the way through this? A bit like a Peter Kay Carl trip.
Almost like a Peter Kay.
Yes.
Yes, I was recording all the way through, although in the end there are other people in that vehicle So you don't do reckless, you don't say, I'm now talking, to a guy who's holding a gun, because, it's not just your safety you're risking, it's 6-7 other people in a vehicle.
And when you got to the Polish border, was there just an immense feeling of relief?
Well, the weird thing, Ian, is there was a bit of relief between. Suddenly we're out of all this kind of mayhem, and on what feels like, to a boy who lives up in Manchester, it's like being on the M6. And we even stopped at the services, and there are happy, cheerful people, and we got some normal food, and so on. And then we got, as you say, with relief to the Polish border, only to discover it's now dark, that there is what looks like a long and quite bad-tempered line of cars. If cars can be bad-tempered, you know what I mean. They're jockeying for position. One's going up on the hard shoulder and the others. And I said to someone, well, about how long is it going to take us? It's 57 kilometres, 2 to 3 days. 2 to 3 days. Now, we weren't going to starve. We'd bought at the last minute in a supermarket some bags of salami and apples and things. But 2 to 3 days, honestly. And therefore you end up with that debate, which is partly about ethics in our business. Press vehicles will get waved through. That fair? Is that a reasonable thing to do? I mean, we concluded in the end it was, and we put a big BBC sign in our window. We made sure we were wearing the flat jackets that say press on them. I felt quite bad about doing that.
And did you get any resistance to that?
No, what was really striking was I thought we would.
Yeah.
And we were seeing people who were so desperate with this queue that they were walking the 57 kilometres or part of it. Actually, what was amazing...
Because people were abandoning cars, weren't they?
Abandoning the cars, yeah. There was a sort of system like you get at a music festival, kind of informal stewarding with guys just in yellow tabards, no guns. But the second they saw those signs, you go and tell them, waved us through. I mean, it was just waved at high speed through. So when we got to the end, we thought we're there, but we sort of weren't.
Let's move on to talk about the difference between radio and television. Now, you did quite a lot of radio in your early years in broadcasting. I mean, you were on 5 Live quite a lot. You used to present with my colleague Sheila Fogarty. And then when you finished being political editor, you then joined the Today programme. Now, was that a big adjustment, moving from the sort of visual medium to the sound medium, or was it almost like getting back on a bike?
Oh, much more the latter than the former. I would say the big adjustment actually was going from reporting to presenting.
Yeah.
I mean, we've just been discussing, I still do some reporting, but my day-to-day job is, as it were, behind a desk in a studio. That was the big adjustment. Going from being, as political editor, someone who sort of always knows, you're paid to know, and being the BBC's political editor, you have the privilege of it being one of the most prominent political reporting jobs in the country, so things come to you, information comes to you, because you've got a big audience. Being that to being much more of a spectator, who's then asking questions, was a much bigger adjustment than radio to telly. Although the joy of radio, I've always thought, is it's what we're doing now. It's intimate. It's a one-on-one.
You can build a relationship with an audience or an individual member of the audience far more easily than you can as a TV presenter.
And I still feel now when I watch television news, and I don't mean as a criticism because I think I did it too, people often look like they're impersonating people on the telly, if you know what I mean. There's a sort of grammar of television reporting which the brilliant reporters smash. One of the reasons I think Clive Myrie has had, as it were, in inverted commas, a great war, is he's brought a humanity alongside analysis and reporting. Lise Doucette does the same, Jeremy Bowen does the same, Andrew Harding, a much less well-known name, usually in southern Africa, now in Ukraine, done some extraordinarily powerful reporting. But television at its worst can be, well, a show, really.
It's also interesting how the presentation of television news has changed in a way that I don't think radio has, in that you've got Tom Bradby now effectively editorialising as he goes along, takes us back to our previous discussion in a sense. And I think that's starting to happen a little bit on BBC News, particularly in these kinds of situations like Ukraine, where Clive Myrie won't hesitate to add a little bit of personal colour into it. And I have no great objection to that, but it's a signal that news is changing, isn't it? Or certainly
Yes.
television news.
There's a great debate in news, isn't there, which is it's not about you, is the thing that is often said.
Sometimes it is, though, isn't it?
Well,
When you are presenting a live breaking story, it is your role to present the facts and interpret them as best as you can. But sometimes there is a bit of personal.
Yes. And there's a difference, of course, between personal experience and personal opinion. And I think that's a very important distinction if we're to maintain impartial presentation of news. So in other words, when I'm in Kyiv, I think there was a value in saying, which I did on the live broadcast the moment the bombing started, I've just heard this, we're being told that. Because in a way I'm living through it. I can't tell you what the people of Kyiv are there, because I'm not in front of them, although we did. My producer went out and found somebody cowering in an underground subway who then we spoke to, and we got that instant reaction. But there's a value in doing that. So I think that's fine. What they don't want from us is we think the war should be fought this way, or we think the war should be that way. I suppose, and it's sometimes a distinction I think people who don't work in my business, don't work in television and radio, find it hard to get. So they might say to me, you said on air, which I did, something along the lines of, as I said to you, I'm the grandson of German Jews. This feels to me like, the biggest event on our continent since. That's your opinion. So, well, no, it isn't. It's a judgment based on personal experience. It's not an opinion in the sense of a partisan opinion. I'm not saying Putin good, bad. Ukraine must win. We ought to. That's an expression of opinion, partial views, which it isn't.
And what about emotion? I mean, have you ever teared up on air?
Oh, God, yeah. Yeah, of course you do. Yeah.
Give me an example.
Well, funny enough, as you asked that, I was trying to think of an example, actually, that worked. I mean, I often say that on the Today programme, which is known really for its political interviews, the thing I found both hardest and most rewarding is human interest interviews. I mean, just this morning when we're recording this, I interviewed a woman who has got the same cancer as Deborah James, the heroic woman who's talked and broadcast about her cancer. She's got bowel cancer. She's got roughly the same prognosis, months to live. She is also very young, the woman I interviewed. Now, as it happens, I've just recently discovered a good friend has stage 4 bowel cancer. I have 3 other friends with stage 4 cancer. I've had cancer. I found that quite tough to do. You can hear it now. I find those conversations are tough.
But from a listener's point of view, they're incredibly powerful, aren't they?
Well, I think so. Again, it's a question of as long as you don't indulge yourself.
Yeah.
So long as you don't say, well, this show's all about me.
Well,
but I think they are powerful because that's...
I remember the first time I did it, it was 2 days after, well, we mentioned the murder of Lee Rigby, it was 2 days after that, and the producer put a MOD statement on my screen, and normally I would read them before I read it out, but I didn't on this occasion, because I think we were coming up to the news, and I thought, no, I need to get this out. And I got to the point where it said, and he had 2 children, and I just went.
Yes.
I can feel myself doing it now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was about 5 seconds before I could recover myself.
Really?
But on radio, it sounds like 20 seconds, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And anyway, I carried on. And then at the end of the hour, I apologised. And I said, sorry, it's not my job to do that. Really sorry. Let's move on. And the text and tweet screen went mad, saying, don't apologise. We were doing the same. You were you were doing what we were doing. Yes. And at that moment, I thought, no, don't be embarrassed. Don't apologise for it. And so it doesn't bother me anymore, because I don't know whether you're like this, but I mean, my mother would cry at anything, and I've inherited that gene.
Yeah. Oh no, I think that's right, Ian. I think that's right. As I say, funnily enough, it wasn't the Lee Rigby case, but I oddly was making a report in a cancer ward, which I was finding rather emotional, when the news broke of the Westminster attack. And I was so close, I hopped on the Bakerloo line, sprinted down here, and bumped into the French school children, the surviving French school children, walking, and interviewed them. And then, it was just one of those moments. I got there very quickly. I interviewed lots of the people there. I found that incredibly emotional. This place, Westminster. It's not my actual home, but it's been my professional home for decades. And when the story happens like that, it's not just that you're grieving for the people involved and seeing the horror. You're grieving for an idea.
Yeah.
Grieving for the idea that politics should be not about conflict. You know, I always, when I used to show people around the House of Commons, as I occasionally did, pointed out those lines on the carpet, which are anachronistic. They're basically to ensure, as you know, that people are 2 sword lengths away. So in the old days when people wore swords, the focus is on using their argument, their speech, in order to win an argument, not their weapons. And for me, something died that day when there was an attack on Westminster, beyond the human tragedy.
What kind of presentation do you most enjoy? I mean, I think with the Today programme, you haven't got that sort of bantery relationship that you have when you're on 5 Live or LBC. I mean, we don't really do co-presenting much, but I love it when I do election nights with Sheila Fogarty, because I think it really works. But do you feel constrained by the format of Today, where, I mean, there's a little bit more banter now, but it's still not quite the same, is it?
There's more than there used to be. And Michelle and I were joking this morning, because she's in Liverpool, where she'd briefly become infected by the terrible disease which is support for Liverpool Football Club.
Oh dear.
I say terrible because I'm a lifelong United fan, and therefore a little part of me dies each time we talk about Liverpool's success. And we joked about that. I think it's a tricky thing, this, isn't it? I mean, I like being more relaxed, and have tried to do that since I joined the programme. There's an older audience that want a fairly formal style. That's what they're used to. More to the point, they want to get through the news stories. They want to, you know, for them it's a briefing for the day. They're not aiming to have a chum. But I think there's things we can learn. There's always things we can learn.
And that's odd in itself, isn't it? Because I think particularly during COVID, most radio presenters, I think, if they didn't know that radio was an intimate medium beforehand, they certainly discovered it during COVID. And people do view you as a chum, and somebody that they hear sort of 3 or 4 days a week, and they feel as if they know you. And I know when people stop me in the street sometimes, and they'll mention the fact that I drive an Audi or I support West Ham, and I sometimes say, how do you know that? And you think, oh, God, is this a stalker or something? Yeah. But they said, well, no, because you mentioned it in that programme you did the other day on XYZ. And of course, you've completely forgotten about it.
I remember the very early days of presenting a radio programme, in literally 2.5 decades on Radio 5 Live, I got in a cab, and the cabbie asked me about my kids, and he knew that I'd got, at that time, 2 kids, and I was sort of unnerved in the way that you are. Yeah. But I think it is intimate, and we show more of ourselves in radio than we do on television, partly because, you know, you're on air for all those hours. You know, there's a lot of time in which there's a bit of you can be revealed. And the other thing is, to state the obvious, radio, and this podcast, you're broadcasting into, you know, intimate spaces. I mean, there may be people listening to this now who are on the loo or in the shower or in bed. You know, these are places that television doesn't I mean, of course it can on your phone, but doesn't generally get to.
I had someone send an email into the podcast I do with Jackie Smith for All the Many, because we actually asked where people listen to us, and there were some really odd answers, but the oddest one was this guy who said, I listen to you while I'm swimming up the River Dart.
You're joking.
And of course you think, swimming? How can you listen?
Do it?
Well, you can now. This is the
get
thing.
Waterproof?
Yeah, apparently.
Oh, God, I need to get some of those.
It's very bizarre.
That sounds also a beautiful river as well. But it's interesting, when I do my political thinking podcast, I say to the
new series out
politician, new series coming, yeah, exactly. Nadine Dorris, first guest. I say to people,
well, I hope you don't get all the hassle I had when I last interviewed her. Oh my God.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I did a 20-minute interview with her. It was the day the broadcasting white paper came out. And the thing with Nadine is, I've known her for a long time. I mean, she's a friend. And I thought, OK, this is a proper political interview, but if I start with hard questions, she's just going to put up the shutters, because that's what she does in all interviews. So, of course, I start fairly gently. And then she says something about, I asked about protecting independent production companies, and she starts talking about when Channel 5 was privatised. And I'm thinking, no, it wasn't privatised. Yeah. But by the time that thought had processed in my mind, she'd sort of moved on a bit. And my main aim was to pin her down on what guarantee she was going to give. But, oh, my God, it wasn't just her that got it in the neck for about the Channel 5 privatisation thing. It was me.
Oh, because you not put it in?
Yeah, because I hadn't picked her up on it. And Andrew Marr said to me, just don't react to it. Just don't react to it. It was a really good interview. You got 3 news lines out of it. Just don't react to it. But it went on for like days. So, of course, I then write a 1,200-word article about why I approached the interview in this way. They say you should never complain, never explain. But I must admit, I don't abide by that.
But you must find all the time that, and I think it's a phenomenon now, much more than it used to be, that why didn't you pick them up on ... The simple answer is there's only so many things you can do in limited time.
Well, and also, when they put the viral clip out, the digital people, obviously they pick out 1 or 2 things from the interview, they put it out on social media, and people say, well, why didn't you say that? I said, well, I did, but 5 minutes later.
Oh, right, okay.
So watch the whole thing.
Yes. or frankly, they don't watch anything at all. So the reaction is to the tweet of the tweet
exactly.
What you're alleged to have said.
Very frustrating.
You didn't quite, but that's the way of the world. Exactly. But what, in a sense, you're illustrating, and I think people don't understand often about interviews, is that for all the preparation you can do, you're making a constant rolling assessment in your head. If I pick that up, which will please the people who want to say, oh, Dean Doris has got it wrong, and they'll be delighted because you made her look silly. Or rather, she made herself look silly, but you put it up. Well, that's 2 minutes, maybe 3 if she gets cross. Maybe the whole interview if she gets so cross that she doesn't answer any of your questions anymore. Well, you can't do all the other things that other people want you to do. Yeah. These are trade-offs.
Yeah, they are, and unfortunately people don't seem to get that, but that's the world we live in. What's the one thing in broadcasting that you haven't done that you'd quite like to? I know it's an awful question.
Goodness me, that's an interesting question. Well, I'm hoping that this is a boring... I'm going to give you a more interesting answer in a second. I mean, I've always... I believe in the big political interview. I'm hoping that come the next election I will be doing the big political interviews on TV for the BBC. I believe in that. But that, in a sense, is a dull question. What's the completely wild... I wouldn't want to do Strictly because I just would be hopeless at it. You have to have that lack of inhibition that Ed Balls has got. And I'd just be
I couldn't do it.
Nervy and awkward. But it's doing something completely out of your comfort zone, completely... I mean, I look sometimes at those... I don't fish, by the way, I should emphasise before saying that. But that show between Paul Whitehouse and Bob Mortimer, where they go fishing... The slowness, the restfulness. I'm a very bad sailor. I have sometimes joked with Ed Balls, who's become a rather fanatical sailor since he gave up politics, that he and I should sail around Britain.
You
bag on about
You've got a house on the coast and you don't like the sea.
No, I do like
the sea. I'm just,
you
just don't want to go on
I'm a bad sailor. As in, I don't like sailing. I like sailing, but I just don't... I'm not very skillful.
Oh, I thought you meant you were seasick all the time.
No. I love sailing. I just don't do enough of it to be very good.
Now, we could go on for about 3 or 4 hours on this, and I haven't asked you anything about how you got into journalism, about your career up to getting into the BBC. So I'm going to ask you to come back in about a year's time, and we can do a proper sort of autobiographical.
Just a year.
Biographical.
Right. Okay.
So that when you launch another series of political thinking, we'll do that then. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It's been a delight coming on, and I'd say this not just to flatter you as you're doing it, but you've shown the power of radio and the power of having conversations about politics, not feeling that it's all about shouting at people.
Thank you very much. And join us again next time on Iain Dale All Talk.